Hello and welcome to Culture and Communication, otherwise known as COM 2023, the online version. Welcome to my fabulous and wonderful studio space. I know it looks totally different than a classroom, but I guarantee you classy stuff will be happening in this space. So also welcome to the first of what I like to call lecturettes. Typically what I would do in a face-to-face class is I would spend half hour or longer discussing certain topics that we don't really get a hold of in either the textbook or in the weekly material that I've posted. I'd spend a long time on this stuff, and we would engage in a conversation, and it would make it a much richer situation. Sadly, we are online. I'm in my space, you're in your space, wherever it is, and we're not really going to be interacting all that heavily face to face. So, what I would like to do then is each week or most weeks, I'm going to try and post what I'm calling a lecturette. And what that is like a short video where I explain some of the concepts that you wouldn't otherwise get a hold of for this class. Also, typically, the work you'll be doing for the class itself that week directly relates to the lecture. Now, since this is week one, there really won't be that happening. I'm just going to introduce some ideas and some topics and get some things in your head during the weekly content. Next week, the lecturette will definitely have more bearing on the topic of the week itself. So, with preamble out of the way, let me again say thank you for taking the class. Welcome to this class. Hopefully, you find it as interesting and as important as I do. And I find this class to be very interesting and very important. So, we'll get to some of that in a bit. I got three things that I want to talk about with you today. Three. I'm trying to figure out where the camera is. Three things that I want to talk about with you today. The first is this idea. I have this phrase I say that all communication is intercultural. Now, typically the understanding of intercultural communication is I'm going to be speaking with someone from a culture other than my own. So, Canadian, male, middle aged, family man, whatever. I'm going to be speaking with someone who is not from my culture. Now, that is a fine definition, especially a dictionary definition of the idea of intercultural communication. But I want to dig into that concept a little more tightly with the phrase "all communication is intercultural." What I mean by this is pretty simple. Every single person is different. Now, duh, Professor. Thank you for dropping the bomb of truth on my head. But bear with me. What I mean by this is that all the way up to perceptions of things like higher ideals, like what is love, who is God, how do we relate to human beings, where do we go after we die. From there, all the way down to like how do I see the color blue versus you see the color blue. Um, how do we hear notes differently? Or when we taste the same food, do we taste it the same way? And the answer to those things is fundamentally no, we don't. We are different people. Even take twins. Twins who have got all the exact same genetic material. They still experience and see things and encounter things differently. So, where does this leave us? Some people would say, well, that makes communication impossible. If I look at a color and I see it as red, you look at a color and you see it as purple, well, we no longer are able to communicate. I would disagree with this wholeheartedly. Thank goodness, because I'm the guy teaching the class. What I mean by this is there is beauty in difference. There is beauty in the fact that you and I look at the same thing, hear the same thing, taste the same thing, and encounter it in a different way. Now, this is especially fascinating when you're trying to communicate with someone from your very own culture. Take my wife and I. We process the world really differently. We experience the world really differently. We think about the things that we encounter really differently. We've been married 14 years now, and a lot of our time is spent making sure that we're understanding each other. There is no person in the world I am socially more in contact with and closer to, yet I have to spend a significant amount of time making sure that we're on the same page. Relate this to a new situation. You meet somebody, especially right now during COVID-19, when this whole idea of wearing masks or not wearing masks, being socially distant or not socially distant. I'm willing to bet you've had an encounter during this period of time that has made you uncomfortable, socially or physically. Now, if you examine that experience, I'm willing to bet you that that made you uncomfortable socially or physically because the other person just didn't understand that it made you uncomfortable. They stood too close. They didn't wear a mask. They didn't obviously sanitize their hands. Right? Like these are people from your very own culture, and yet there is difference. There is some sort of disconnect. So when we think of intercultural communication, we tend to think of big, broad, sweeping. I'm Canadian and I'm speaking to somebody from Africa. You're Canadian, you're speaking to somebody from Central Asia. I would say let's refine that topic down and understand it in a more day-to-day kind of way. All communication is intercultural because you come from a place of culture and you are speaking to a person who also has a culture all their own, and there is difference there. So keep that in mind as we go through this first week. The second thing I want you to keep in mind is this other phrase where I like to say there is no such thing as normal when it comes to communication and culture. This gets a bit tricky. You are steeped in culture from the day that you're born. You are indoctrinated. The rights, the wrongs, moral good, moral bad, rules about social behavior, these are all pretty much bred into you. One of the ways that I express this in class, I'll say this again and again and again, is you are one single ingredient thrown into a stew, right? Like the meal, stew, and you are cooked in that stew your whole life. Take you out of the stew, stew changes. But you change as well as a result of being in that stew. So here's what I mean when I say that there is no normal. We tend to think of our own culture as normal. I come from an Italian family. Thus, I think that families ought to argue loudly with each other and they ought to gesticulate. And then at the end of that argument, they ought to hug and kiss and get over it. My wife comes from a family that does not argue. That created some very interesting things when we first got married because I would just be wanting to talk it out and I'd be not aggressive, active, and my wife would think I was enraged and I wasn't even warm. I wasn't even worked up, but the family that I come from argues, right? I thought mine was normal. She thought hers was normal. When we come together as a family, we figure out neither of these are normal. It's just the way that I've always done it. It's the way that you've always done it. Now, this is a wonderful thing to remember because when we start to think of our own culture as normal, we start to think of our own culture as best. Right? Maybe you see the problem there. In this course, we're going to be looking at a lot of touchy subjects like religion, belief in God, body language, nonverbal communication, the way that you interact with and see the world, your understanding of how history and future inform who you are as a person now. These are personal topics in which we are deeply invested. And the impulse is going to be to say, well, this is how I see it, and I'm right. Easy, Tiger. What I want you to start thinking of is this is how I see it. You see it the way you see it. Now let's interact our two little ways of seeing it and figure out what information there is to figure out. So please, moving forward, take with you the idea that there is no such thing as normal when it comes to culture and communication. No language, no cultural practices, no such thing as normal. There is accepted and unaccepted, but normal, that's a swear word in my class from now on. So then the last thing that this brings me to, the third topic that I want to talk about this today, is the idea of respect. There are times in this class where you are going to be interacting with each other, either discussion posts or projects or what have you. Fundamentally, my class is built on a position of respect. And what I mean by that is I will not at all in any way accept disrespectful language, disrespectful behavior, or bullying toward your fellow students. They have just as valid, they have just as reasonable, they have just as good of an answer as you do. And any behavior that crosses that line over into bullying or disrespect is absolutely not going to be tolerated. The other thing that I mean by this is I want you to respect your own time as well. I'm expecting about 3 hours a week at least out of you for this class. That's a significant time investment for you, I would assume. So, what I'm going to ask you is this: while you're doing my classwork, focus on my classwork. Give me 3 hours. You'd have had to give me 3 hours had we done face to face anyway. So, block off a little bit of time. Give me 3 hours, and I promise I will not waste your time. That leads me to the third portion of respect, which is respect my time. I am a husband and a father. I've newly bought a house that is deeply undergoing renovation, and I'm doing most of it. I like to cook a lot. There's a lot of things I'd like to be doing with my time, but I consciously carve out time for your class. So while you're going through the assignments, while you're going through the material, remember that I've put some time and energy into this. Please engage with it seriously. Please give me good output, and I promise you I will do everything I can to make it a rewarding and valuable class for you. That brings me to the end. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. All you have left at this point, if you're going through the week sequentially, is to post your discussion post. And then next week's folder will be available to you Sunday morning. So thank you very much. See you next week.